All right, I would like to introduce our speaker this evening on the topic of how to speak science. She's Dr. Tammy Bosler. She received her PhD in physics from UC Irvine in 2004 while working on her academic research in astrophysics. She also developed an extensive public outreach program with local schools and community members that reached thousands of people, inspiring fledgling scientists. She worked as a science policy intern at the National Academies in 2005. Following her time at the academies, she worked at the National Science Foundation as a science policy fellow for the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where she helped with the funding of the National Ground-Based Astronomy Program. In addition to her dedication to science, Tammy is a longtime practitioner of yoga and Zen, which she started practicing over 20 years ago while embarking on her science career. In the past decade, she has shifted her professional work to the therapeutic applications of yoga and mindfulness practices locally in Regensburg, Germany, on retreats in Italy, and thanks to technology, internationally over Zoom before it was cool. Please visit yoga-digital.com if you want more details and links to cool stuff that she works on. I will drop that link in the chat box. And now I'm going to toss control over to Tammy.
So, so thanks for sharing, those of you who let me know why you were here today, because that helps sort of how I'm coming at this. I've done a lot of science outreach. Much of that has been with kids, trying to convince them why science is a great thing to do and why scientist is a great job idea to have. But for you guys, I figure maybe selling you on being a scientist is not why I'm here. So my thoughts were more about how to provide some context for this thing we call science, since the DA is the one thing that pulls us all together here. I think it's important for us to consider the context of science in this discussion. Of course, the pandemic is the big piece of science that keeps coming up over and over again, along with climate change, and these are some of the big issues that cannot be ignored and that are really funded in science. So, given the way that I approach this, I wanted to sort of give you a sense of the context of science as a field and as a human discipline, because it's something that's been with humanity now for thousands and thousands of years, at least the roots of it. And in particular, sort of laying out what science is and what it isn't. Also looking at the intersection of science and public policy, which for most of us these days, when we're talking about science, we're really talking about this intersectional point of how we utilize existing science to do something for the world or for the people. And so in honor of our homeland now, Germany, for those of us who are here from Germany, I thought we would start with a quote from a professor of physics from Berlin in the 1930s. She was the first female professor of physics in Germany, and her name is Lise Meitner. And she said, "Science makes people reach selflessly for truth and objectivity. It teaches people to accept reality with wonder and admiration." And it's really just a reminder that scientists and people who are working in science are people who are tremendously passionate about whatever it is they're working on. These typically aren't people who are in it for some other reason, whether it be power or funding or whatever it is. There is really, at the foundation of it, science is a little bit too hard to do for anything other than the science itself. So as a person who spent a lot of time in science, I have a tremendous amount of enthusiasm for the field and for what it offers the world. So I hope to sort of share that with you guys today. And as we go, if there's any questions that arise, Sarah is going to be monitoring the comments. So if you have anything that you want to ask as I'm going, feel free to pop questions in. And I trust my capacity to keep us on track as we go. Otherwise, we can talk at the end as well. So I wanted to start really at the beginning. This idea that every ancient culture of humans discovered evidence about nature and the reality of nature at some point. Fundamentally, this point has always been when we had the luxury of stopping and having time and capacity to observe the natural world. So these are just some images from places around the world: South America, China, Middle East, Central America, and India in this case. And all of these structures have a few things in common: mathematics, astronomy, and religion. So all of these created by people, created with the ability to watch nature over time. In this case, most of these structures were created with astronomical alignments in mind, which mean it took hundreds of years of people observing how the sky is moving. And they were able to create tremendous structures which aided their survival. So these structures weren't purely esoteric. They were there to essentially help the foundation of human culture. And you see structures like this all over the world. You see indications that every human culture realized that understanding the natural world was not just something for the spirit, it was very much something for the survival of the species. And so when we consider religion and science, it's easy, particularly nowadays, for people to dismiss, to think of them as sort of two separate things. But it's important to realize that there's a fundamental connection here, because science is an endeavor, a human endeavor. And the foundations of science and religion come from the same place. There's a great quote I had shared with Sarah as we were talking about this by Ricky Gervais, the comedian, when he was being interviewed by Stephen Colbert, who is a devout Catholic. And Gervais said something like, if you destroy every fiction, including religion, in 1,000 years, you would have a bunch of different stories than the fictions that exist today. And if you destroyed every scientific text in 1,000 years, you would have the same kind of science that we have today, which I like the idea of that argument sort of at the face of it. But if you dig a little deeper, there's a lot of assumptions there that don't hold up. And first of all, 1,000 years is far too small of a time scale on what we have today. But more importantly, the foundations of science are not as objective as we like to think they are. So, for example, we have numbers in many different traditions, which are sort of important numbers: sacred numbers, lucky numbers, things like that. I'm just giving an example of a few here, but number 3, we see repetition of number 3 in a lot of cultures as a way to acknowledge the importance of something. 3 here being the earth, moon, and sun, foundational bodies in religion and also in astronomical sense. 5 is the number of wanderers in the night that are not stars. Lucky number 7 is those wanderers connected with the sun and moon, so the 7 things in the sky that are not background stars. And we have to remember that these numbers all across the globe come up again and again in spiritual and religious traditions, because those traditions are founded in the natural world, as is science today. But when we look at these numbers a little closely and how they impact our world today, we can't separate the science and religious foundations quite as simply. So number 12, for example, the number of lunar cycles in a solar cycle, we see this through many different traditions of religious texts as well. And religious traditions, the number 12 comes up over and over again. But also, when we look at the mathematical foundations of how we communicate the natural world, which is mathematics, if we take a circle and divide it into 360 pieces, slices, each one of those slices is what's called a degree. So that's a way of cutting out that circle could have been done any number of ways. 360 is specific because we live on this earth, which a solar cycle is 360 days approximately, at least in the times where these ideas were developed. So essentially, the foundation of our mathematical system today was created through these arbitrary choices of ancient mathematicians. And all of the framework for the physics and the mathematics that we use to understand the natural world have been colored and shifted by the fact that we live on the earth, which circles the sun every 365 days. So there is a new show on Apple Plus called Foundation, which is a science fiction show about math. Very slow show. We're trying to get into it. But one of the things I really liked about it was they had a meeting in this planet about how they were going to be going out and sort of getting together other cultures and other planets. And the diplomats were speaking about the typical things you might think of. And the mathematician comes in and she says, well, which mathematical units or which mathematical framework are we going to use? Are we going to keep base 27? Are we going to keep base 12 because 7 other planets use this other base? So it went into this imagination that other systems will have a fundamentally different mathematical foundation, which I haven't seen before in science fiction, which I thought was a great concept, because in Star Trek, everybody has the same math, but in this idea. So our math is relative. Mathematics is the language of nature in which science speaks. So there is a relativity to the concept of science that I think is important to keep in mind. So though I'm pro-science, I'm pro-actual science and not the fantasy of what science is. So there is a relativity to these ideas. So at some point, of course, what we call religion, what we call science diverged, because the nature of reality is fundamentally changed. But in religion, there's a need for an immutable God-like figure. And in the ancients, the skies were as close to that as we could come. Nature on the earth was changing seasons, cycles. But the stars in the sky on the human time scale don't change. And so at some point, we had to separate the two. For our sort of modern culture, I think the seeds of this really started happening in the time of Isaac Newton and Leibniz. We're in Germany. We give credit to Leibniz as well, who essentially figured out the calculus that Newton is credited for. Because at some point, as mathematics became fundamental to science, it started to disagree with some of our assumptions about religion and essentially the nature of cosmos. Because science is a process that observes, it analyzes, it interprets the evidence in a particular context. It never asks if this is the story we've been told before. It tries to look at what's being told now. And this concept of context, when we talk about what Dawn and Cliff had mentioned, sort of living in a culture where misinformation and pseudoscience are sort of being thrown around a lot, that becomes easier when you take a science concept out of the context in which it is. So it's not just I haven't put up here anywhere in the talk really that science is the process of a hypothesis and observation and reaffirming. And, there is a step to science. It's not always the same step, but it does have these things in common: observations, analysis, interpreting the evidence in a particular context. If you take out any of those pieces, it fails to hold up to the rigor of science. And one really important thing in the realm of science is community is mandatory. There has never been and will never be lone geniuses figuring out the world of science. There has always been a community of people, either in the process itself of coming up with new ideas or figuring out directions to go, or in the people essentially criticizing the science that's out there. So when we look on YouTube, we see a lot of sort of monologues without questions, without debate, without discussion. And this has never been the realm of science. We can sort of summarize and contextualize with that kind of thing, but science is actually done in the realm of community. And like this quote on the right by Robert Sapolsky. Robert Sapolsky is this really interesting behavioral neuroscientist. He's one of those people who really looks at like how the brain is activated when we make certain decisions in our life. And he put it really succinctly: we don't have facts in science. We have a temporary assessment of how accurate our hypothesis is, which really doesn't sound very catchy. It doesn't have a good, like, catchphrase, but it's really what it is. It's very simply a progression in a particular direction. And at times this direction has to change, but it's always progressing in some way. And without the context of what exists and what's happening, mythology and misinformation start to grow. And, that's from my perception of conversations with people stuck in a cycle of confusion about what's happening in the field of science, is that there's a little bit of stuckness in this mythology of science. So that's why it's important to consider history of science itself. And when we sort of look at the real history of science, it helps us to step back a little bit when we're sort of, presented with ideas of how science is and who scientists are. So the history of science, there are some facts. Many of the ones we learn are wrong. Even this year, I got a book of science for my daughters, which had so many of these mythologies still in them. The mythologies that white European men did and discovered everything all by themselves, which has never been true. There are many what I call unaccredited co-authors and collaborators, the people who've been involved in the process of science from the beginning, but whose names we don't know. Non-Europeans are the mathematical foundation of modern math and science. So one of the greatest contributions from the Greeks was to develop the phonetic language so that these ancient traditions could be brought together in one language that could then be further translated and further translated. And this is the foundation of what we call modern science, at least through the European pathway. Women, LGBTQ people, people of color across the entire world have contributed significantly to science. From people who worked at the level of some of the men credited with the discoveries, to also work that they did despite of the atmosphere around them. Because it's not that women, for example, are underrepresented. I don't like that phrase anymore. Women were traditionally excluded from science. It's not like we just aren't there. There was an exclusion. And since science is always done in community, those who are excluded from the community were simply not able to take part. And there were some notable exceptions, often coming from what they call non-traditional pathways.
Hey, Tammy,
Sarah,
can I put in for just a moment? I've got a hand up on what you stated about community being mandatory. I'm going to mute and let Cliff go ahead and ask his question.
Okay.
I hope this is an opportune time for it, and if not, it's better addressed later. That's fine too. But I'll ask the question now because your slide reminded me of it. I'd like to know how a community can effectively self-police or weed out bad actors or self-correct when it recognizes it's on the wrong course. Again, if this is coming later, feel free. I'll wait and hold.
Yeah. Well, when I say community here, I should be more precise. So when I say community, I'm not necessarily referring to a group of people. I'm referring to the process of essentially a community of criticism. And when I say criticism, so conversation has sort of changed the vocabulary of how we speak of things. Criticism and skepticism in science are good things, and they're rewarded, and they're part of the process. So it is the job of other scientists to essentially police what's out there. And you will have biases reinforced in that way. But at the end of the day, science never exists in a bubble. It always has practical applications. Even if we don't know what, at some point it has practical applications. And when the rubber hits the road, what doesn't work. And so we've seen it time and time again where biases have fed into the community. One of the most powerful, painful examples is how science was used to reinforce the concepts of racism for hundreds of years. But eventually, even the science could not be denied of what was real and what was not. And so, yes, so you're absolutely right. There's a part of this where a community is reinforcing its own ideas. And at the end of the day, that never holds up. Because when you find a contradiction to an existing theory, it has to be re-examined, whether people want it to or not. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, cool. So there have been a lot of people who've traditionally been underrepresented, not underrepresented, who've been traditionally excluded. And some of them found a way anyway. For example, the foundation of our stellar catalogs in astronomy was created by a Department of Women in Harvard University. One of these women was actually the maid of the director of the program. And he found her to be extremely organized and brought her in to use her to hire her to help make sense of a lot of information he had. They were the first computers. That was their job title. But these computers made the foundation of modern stellar astronomy. So the stories are not always what we call classical stories. Those stories of classical astronomers were typically people of tremendous privilege. And something to keep in mind with the history of astronomy is something I call the Trimble effect. Virginia Trimble was a mentor of mine, and she, in the last decades of her career, her primary service to the community was to read every publication in English in astronomy and astrophysics and to summarize it every year. So if she was there, she was reading, at least when I knew her. And she was Google before Google existed, is what somebody recently said of her. So whenever she would give science talks, she would always involve the history of science, as you can see, strongly inspired by her. And she pointed out several times that whenever something is named after somebody, it's almost never the person who first discovered it or thought of it. And so this effect, which Trimble surely did not first come up with, but I'm calling it the Trimble effect to honor the tradition, is all over science. So, every example I learn, I keep a mental note of, because I think it's great to know how the stories became. But the stories we've been told about science fed a particular narrative, and it's good to question that narrative. So again, coming back to Cliff's point too, skepticism and questioning of assumptions is really important in science, even if you're a proponent of science. And there we go. So one example of this, I'll just throw out there. So 1905 is arguably a year when there was a big shift to what we might call modern physics. This was the year that 4 publications came out. So this was the work of Albert and Meleva Einstein. So probably everybody here has heard of Albert. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of Meleva. Probably not that many. So 4 papers came out this year. 2 papers on the nature of the very small, 1 paper on the nature of light and time, and 1 paper on energy, essentially. And these papers essentially became the foundation, in addition to other work, of quantum physics, thermodynamics, relativity, and a huge part of nuclear physics. So this has been the 20th century physics. This came from the collaboration of 2 people. we know it's a collaboration of two people, not because any of those publications were also in her name. She was married to Albert, and they studied together. She was the only woman studying with her cohort there. And she was also the only person in the class to be failed at the final exam. So she actually never had her degree. But because they were two dorky people, apparently they spent a lot of evenings together working on physics. So these 4 publications didn't come out of the blue. They weren't created in somebody's mind. They were addressing some particularly challenging issues in the world of physics at the time. They were done with the knowledge of and the contributions of other people as well. And we know this because they wrote letters to each other, and their oldest child published these letters in the 80s. So they both referred to the work of these 4 papers as our work. And it was pretty clear, even based on the testimony of people who knew them, that they would spend their evenings working on these things. But at the time, Albert needed an academic appointment so he could get out of the patent office. And so he wasn't also the kind of man to put his wife's name on their work. And so she sort of disappeared in the history of physics in the 20th century. And we all know what happened to Albert. He did pretty well for himself after that. So when we talk about science, a phrase that we're hearing a lot today is, know the facts, do your research. These kind of ideas come up a lot. When I used to go to schools, I would often work with 3rd graders, talking to them about astronomy. And there is no level of unearned confidence as high as the confidence of a 3rd grade boy who has memorized a science book. Oh my God. So these boys made my job tremendously challenging, but also had a lot of enthusiasm. So 3rd graders love science. They loved astronomy in particular. But there was often one kid who had a book and memorized every fact in this book. And he knew more about, the average temperature on Mercury than I did, for sure. But in his mind, that was science. And it's important to remember and to realize that expertise is a thing. Expertise exists. Science, people who are working in science, whatever their field is, they're an expert not because they've memorized a collection of facts, although memorizing some facts is important, but it's because they understand the context of where this information came from, how it's applied, and how it's used. And fundamentally, there's a deep humility that comes with truly understanding a topic, because each time we learn one layer of information, it reveals 10 new layers that we didn't even know existed. And, this is one image that I often show in popular science talks, that what we call baryonic matter, it's a fancy word for stuff, like as we know stuff, like stars and galaxies and stuff. Anything that we can, that we identify as pieces of the universe is what we call baryonic matter. Baryonic matter is about 5% of the observable universe. What this means is we look out at the universe, we see how things are moving, and based on what we understand about things like mass and movement and gravity and stuff like that, it implies that there's a whole bunch more stuff out there that we're not seeing. And that other 95% of the universe, which I'm calling don't know universe, is we literally don't know what it is. It might be something we just can't detect, something that is beyond the capacity of our instrumentation. It could be that all of the rules of physics are wrong on a really important level, and so our observations don't meet the theory. But really, we don't know. We have ideas we call dark matter, dark energy. Dark matter means maybe some invisible stuff, and dark energy means we really don't know. Like maybe gravity works backwards too. But basically, we don't know. So if you're at least a physicist and you realize that you don't understand 95% of the existence of the universe, there's like a deep level of humility that arises with that. And any good scientist is a scientist who can say, I don't know. That's what I learned in grad school. The ones who are not so good will always have an answer, even if they aren't so sure. The ones who are really good are comfortable saying, I don't know, or we don't know. And so that's an important concept that comes from deep knowledge. And so if you are talking to somebody who has a point about science that you don't know, it's perfectly okay, at least from a scientific point of view, to say, well, I don't know. And, I can do research and things like that. Doesn't look good on like the news stations, though, people like to seem to yell at each other on news stations and things. So another thing to keep in mind, something Sarah and I came across when talking about this idea, is words have meaning. And this isn't really just the science thing, but it bears repeating in today's environment. Words have meaning. There was a friend of mine who's a high school teacher here who recently was talking about racism with her kids. And there was one young woman who didn't understand that racism had something to do with racism. Like, she thought racism meant being judgmental towards somebody. So she had to reaffirm this concept that race and racism are particular words that have a particular meaning. This comes up a lot in science as well, because science doesn't just happen in the mind of a scientist. It happens in community, and it happens in the world. So not only do scientists have to communicate with other scientists, scientific community has to communicate with people at large. And remember, something we've learned really, really powerfully in the last few years is how much power words have. Another quote from behavioral scientist Sapolsky, words can save, cure, uplift, devastate, deflate, and kill. A lot of his work works on essentially the concept of free will and how our brains can be hijacked with misinformation, with priming. One of the best people at utilizing this fact are people like Donald Trump. He may be a lot of things, but one of the things he is great at is priming people to alter their behavior. And something that is important also in the world of science, because when we are speaking about scientific ideas, scientific jargon always has a very specific meaning in a specific context. And likewise, scientific language sounds imprecise because science doesn't often deal in absolutes. Science deals with percentages, chances, risks. It's not that it's using weak language, it's that it's using precise language, because our nature of understanding is always changing and fluid. And even though sometimes there's a small risk of something happening, that something may happen nonetheless. And so scientists are trying to really communicate to people what's happening and how it's happening. And my little meme here, just for your entertainment, of the bird standing on the bench railing. Really important concept, correlation and causation, especially in the context of the pandemic science discussions. Recently, there was, in the past year, there were some healthcare professionals noticing that a larger percentage of people who were quite sick from COVID also had vitamin D deficiencies. And so two things happened. One thing is a bunch of people started taking vitamin D. And second is that some scientists actually looked into this. So they did a proper investigation, Europe and the US as well, and Israel as well, because they thought, okay, if there's something there, maybe this will help with what's happening. And what they found was that correlation was there. But what we were picking up on is the fact that some people who have a chronic deficiency of vitamin D develop some health conditions which are comorbidities to COVID. And so they found that taking vitamin D did not prevent a person's chances from getting sick. They did not help anybody who was sick because the chronic vitamin D deficiencies is very different from taking short-term vitamin D supplements, for example. And I had to explain that ad nauseum to somebody recently. So, but there was a difference between correlation and causation, a really important point. And then there's the challenge of a good story, because most times when we're talking about science, we're really talking about the story of science or the application of science or the public policy of science. And I just saw this Keanu Reeves meme, and if you don't want to hear the science part, it's a nice, funny thing to read. And here are the weaknesses and the strengths of science. It moves slowly. It's done by consensus. It's conservative. And when I say conservative here, I mean not politically conservative, but when there is something that works, science will go with what works before it moves away from that. So it moves slowly because it's holding on to what's functioning already. Science, by a lot of standards, is boring. And I put boring in quotes here because I feel that boring is sometimes a perception of a complex idea. So science is communicated with a lot of detail, a lot of complexity, because it's done in community, it's done with consensus. So the details are important not only to the people who've done the studies, but the people who need to read the studies and implement the information coming out of those studies. But for the general public, it can be quite overwhelming and complex. And scientists are generally not rewarded for public outreach. The last 20 years or so, the US government in particular, and in Europe as well, have really tried to shift funding priorities to try to motivate scientists to be more communicative. And academic research is still not really made a lot of headway, though. A few scientists themselves have made some great strides. There's a fantastic podcast that my husband and I both listen to by a guy named Sean Carroll, who's a physicist, and he brings people on to talk about all kinds of subjects. But he has a fantastic way of really getting into the heart of the matter that he's talking about. And he is going to moving away from his academic position because there's no place for him in what he's doing. He's becoming really a public advocate for science, but there's no place for him in academic research or academic institutions even because of how he's moving. And so we actually lose some of the support from some of our most enthusiastic proponents of science because there is this sort of disconnect between the scientific institutions and the people who are best communicating what they're doing. And science does move slowly, but sometimes it seems to be moving quickly, which is not always a good thing. So one of the things in the past year and a half has been the vaccines for the coronavirus. So at first glance, and how it was often reported, made it seem like we created a vaccine in 3 months, which was not the case. So the timeline, the quick timeline to the vaccinations was 2019 December. Dr. Li Wenliang warned the world about this new virus. His warning wasn't some sort of, well, maybe something's going on. This was a doctor who had worked with other coronaviruses, other pathogens that were very similar to this, and he recognized that this was something different and something new. And so he put out the alert to his professional detriment, and unfortunately he passed away from the virus, but he alerted the world that this was happening. And in January, decades of science kicked in. Scientists were able to isolate the virus. Again, this is coming from decades of other work with viruses very similar to this one. Dr. Wang Jianwei's group and his collaborators, they were able to sequence the virus. So just a month later, they had a sequence for this new virus. And within that month, they were also able to create a test to test people for this virus. So testing, as we've learned, something that Germany did really, really well. was creating reliable testing from very, very early on. But this didn't get created in a vacuum. It was existing technologies. And the US, for some reason, really stumbled on this very early in the process. They couldn't get reliable test kits for the coronavirus very early on. But the tests were created very quickly. And by April, we had the first clinical trials for the BioNTech vaccines. And very shortly, other companies did as well. Because that mRNA vaccine work was decades of work by Caitlin Carrico's team. This is a scientist who had a hard time keeping down a job because there was not much interest in funding in what she was doing, of using this technology. And this technology was also built upon the backs of decades of research going into the AIDS virus. So even though the news presented this as sort of 3 months, we have a vaccine, which sounds like a miracle, it's a great story, because of how it was presented, it actually fed into some of the confusion, the mistrust, and misinformation that people had about this vaccine. I've talked with several people who they're not anti-vaccine, but became very skeptical because of how they understood this vaccine was developed. And it was completely inaccurate to what happened. But it was the story of how it goes. So we have to be careful how we sell the story of science when we are trying to support public policy that is in alignment with what the science is telling us. So, now we start moving into this realm. Science reporting is sort of the intersection between where science happens and how science interacts with the public. And so some red flags to consider whenever you're reading a science article about a new miracle or something that's been proven 100%, it's a cure, it's a breakthrough. It's worth looking very carefully. So the nature of science is change, and it's a feature, not a bug, as you might say. So early in the pandemic, for example, and I'll keep using this example because it's so relevant to where we are today. There was differing recommendations, don't wear masks, wear masks, wash down all your groceries. Oh, wait, we don't have to do that. This was a new situation occurring in real time. And so this is what it looks like when science is trying to apply the best it has to a new situation. So it wasn't that new science was happening. It was that we were trying to take the old way of interpreting and understanding the situation and applying it to a new situation. And it was wrong very often. But as new information came in, it changed. And unfortunately, the way that we tell the story of things like science, it's often portrayed as this godlike concept that science is solid. Science can be solid and then change the next day, and it's still solid science. Because remember, in science, the most convincing thing we have is not a fact, it's a theory. And so when we use language, the precision of language in science, a theory is the most solid thing we have. When in everyday life, a theory, it's just a theory, which means an opinion, an idea. So every day and through this pandemic, we have cultivated new hypotheses, and slowly those hypotheses and evidence and observations are all building up to a more reliable theory of what's happening with this virus. So some things to keep in mind when reading about science. So proper science has benchmarks and repeatability. So there's, for example, in the realm of vaccines, again, we had a study that linked autism to some childhood vaccines. This study was not repeatable. Nobody else found these same ideas. The benchmarks were under question. But again, the way it was reported as a breakthrough, something that's been discovered, or some secret information that was being hidden, is unfortunately gave people some very strong, unmoving ideas about vaccinations. So again, it's not necessarily the science that changed people's minds, but the perception of what science is and what it is. So one study never defines a topic in science. Science is slow and it's never finished, only underfunded generally. So once science loses its funding, that particular area becomes very quiet. Like the mRNA studies were there and not heavily utilized, but now it's like a huge hot topic, and there's going to be a ton of money going into that field now that the coronavirus vaccinations came. Another challenge is that the details of science are not accessible on two levels. One is that if you were to go to the root source of scientific literature and read a study on, say, epidemiology, there's a very good chance you won't understand a majority of it. I don't read those kind of studies because I don't understand the jargon. I don't understand the acronyms. They make no sense. So we need experts who can take this information, synthesize it, and present it clearly and truthfully. You will find that these experts tend to agree with a lot of other experts. And of course, you'll have outliers of people who disagree. But again, it's not the loudmouth who makes the consensus on science. It is the scientific community. And every once in a while, the loudmouth is right. But generally speaking, the loudmouths get forgotten and the consensus moves forward. And another thing, which is a problem, which scientists are sort of finding a workaround out, is literally they're not accessible. It's very challenging to find actual scientific articles because they're behind publishers' paywalls. And for many of them, you can't access them without an institutional affiliation unless you email the authors who just send them to you. But slowly, we're also taking advantage of PDF servers, so you can find most of them today. So important for, I think, the DA is to consider when science becomes policy, because this is really where the contention comes in. There's not a lot of people actually arguing about science. Like, the people on the street are typically not arguing science. They're arguing public policy about science. Things like abortion, people try to use scientific language to discuss it. The abortion is not a scientific discussion. The science of abortions is very clear. It's the public policy of essentially legislating medical treatments. That's what's being fought on the streets. So science policy, like the science itself, are made via consensus, and they depend upon funding priorities. So there's something in science today that needs to be remembered too, is that money is part of the equation, which, some people take that and they make conspiracy theories out of it. There's not a lot of people going into science for the money. Generally speaking, there's not a lot of money for being a scientist, but scientific ideas follow funding priorities. Those funding priorities typically are created through the scientific community as a whole, at least in the United States. So I'm speaking now specifically to how this works in the United States. Europe, I know, is at least different, and Europe and the US are the only ones that I have a deep understanding of. And in the US, we have the FDA, so the Federal Drug Administration, the Center for Disease Control, National Science Foundation, NIH. These are all executive branch agencies, and they use science to inform and implement policy in the United States. We have some private entities like the National Academy of Science. It's contracted by the government, and their job is to convene experts and create documents to recommend scientific consensus and scientific priorities. And then there's NGOs and scientific consortia, which also can make recommendations. But this is sort of given on the level of where the more power lies. So the executive branch agencies have a tremendous amount of influence on national science policy, where the money goes essentially, and how we move forward as a country in these directions of science. So the National Academies has had actually for decades now been one of the big sources of recommendations for climate change recommendations. So what's happening and what technologies are moving forward. So Dawn had mentioned climate change. And you can find actually some of their documentations, I think, through their website on what the recommendations are. And these recommendations from like 20 years ago are still feeding forward. Even though they're changing with time, the recommendations haven't changed tremendously. It's how they've been implemented that are being changed. And this is just to give you a sense. So this is a very simplified explanation of how the US government works. So you've seen the three branches of government: the legislative, executive, judicial branch. Everything below is a piece of the executive branch. So essentially, the science in the United States is largely funded by these pieces that are in pink here. So largest pockets of money for research coming from the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Health and Human Services, and some of the smaller agencies like NASA, NSF, EPA. There are private funding of research, but those private fundings of research generally aren't completely separate from the US government. So we have, for example, pharmaceutical companies. They do a lot of their own research, but their products and what they bring out of it has to be regulated by the US government. So they're not sort of separate from this chain, even though the pocket of money is different. And most importantly, the legislative branch has fingers in this because their job is to allocate money. And although they're not the ones deciding science policy in the United States, they are deciding which parts of the US government are getting funded and at what level. And so the executive branch is changing every 4 to 8 years. Some of the scientists in these areas are being replaced every 4 to 8 years, so they're political appointees. Some of the political appointees even stay on for new administrations. Some of them don't. But the vast number of people determining science policy in the US are actually scientists working in these agencies or rotating through temporary assignments in these agencies from academic institutions. And the legislative branch has very little say over that. And the public servants, who are often scientists in some of these areas, are lifetime public servants. They're not coming in through different administrations. So there's an institutional memory of the trajectory of science policy in the US via the executive branch. And it kind of depends on, what the funding comes through from the legislative branch, how some of these things are implemented from year to year. So when we think of the legislative branch, it's a really complicated machine. Their primary job is to allocate money. And a few times a year, they actually pass proper laws, but that's about it. That's what they do as a body. Rush Holt, who was a plasma physicist at Princeton, he has been in the House for quite a while. And he said that working in the House has been intellectually the most challenging thing he's ever done, much harder than physics. And so when people say follow the science, we should follow the science on this issue, we should follow the science. He had some thoughts on this. He said, if you think of things as balancing of competing interests, you'll be able to lose some of your preconceptions about what must be done and what is right. So there are more policyholders in a public policy decision than just the economy, just the science. People will be impacted by the decisions that are made. So if, for example, we wanted to follow the science on something like climate change, we could shut down all commercial aircraft. We could shut down supply lines. We could stop the world for a period of time. There would be repercussions of that. And so the job of public policy is to figure out how to balance economic, public health, environmental priorities and still go in the direction that we think we need to go in. And if you're working on the Hill, there are 3 P's that really determine who's successful at these jobs, not just who keeps their job, but who acquires power, who's able to impact the decisions being made. And those 3 P's are policy, politics, and process. So the policy is what we need to do. We need to change the trajectory of the global temperature. That's what we need to do. The politics of it, that's messy. So politics gets you rehired into this job so you can try to keep doing the work that you're doing. The process is how it's done. So one advantage that, for example, Joe Biden has coming in as president is 40 years as a senator. 40 years as a senator means that he knows how things get done in the government. Donald Trump's greatest weakness was exactly this. He had no concept of how government functioned because it does not function like a business. And so if you're trying to be a CEO, you will be useless at having long-term policies go forward. And we saw this as the administrations changed. The first steps that Joe Biden did was essentially cut off a vast majority of the actions that Trump did, because the actions that Trump was able to do, he did only from the executive branch. He did very little through the legislative. The legislative policies are the policies that are very challenging to undo. And there's a silent P in these 3 Ps, and it is partisanship. And it is growing louder each year. So rather than deciding on how to get the job done, which is really the role of the 3 Ps, the question is, how do I win? And this is changing the game more and more. We can see, for example, Marjorie Taylor Greene. She is powerless because she's been taken out of the process part. She lost all of her assignments because of her behavior. And so the only thing she has done is play the partisanship, yelling at Democrats on the stairs of the Capitol, one thing she did recently. And another thing she did is she found out that any member of Congress can essentially call everybody to take roll at a certain time of the day. This is usually not done because people are in meetings actually trying to do some work. But she could press that button, and it required everybody to leave the meetings they were in and to come in and check in. So what she ended up doing was just pissing off her cohort, pissing off other Republicans who were actually trying to do work. But she wasn't able to do anything else but essentially make noise, because she didn't realize going in that the ability to follow some process actually gives you power. And so who knows if she'll learn that or not. But we also see this partisanship coming in just this week when the Senate passed the short-term solution of shifting the debt ceiling another couple months. And this required a lot of strategizing by the Republicans, trying not to look like they're doing what they had to do. And so they sort of seemingly gave in, which is, again, partisanship perspective. They didn't give in. They had one job to do, and it was to raise the debt ceiling. After this kind of compromise was made, Chuck Schumer came out and gave this very partisan speech to basically say, look, I won. And so all of the goodwill that kind of went into that last negotiation has just been kind of lost a little bit. So this partisanship game is a new way of, not a new way, it's an amplified part of what's always been there. And it's clogging up the works. So what little the legislator was able to do before then, it's slowly clogging up even that much. And partisanship, there's very little that science has to do with partisanship. So science in this context is all about policy. So science can inform the policy, but at the end of the day, policymakers have to balance these other parts. And one of the things that an organization that I was involved in, the AAAS, they bring scientists in to work on the Hill and in the executive branch agencies to bring in sort of the ethical foundations and the investigative rigor of science to inform policymakers about how to make these decisions. So that's sort of where we are in science and policy and public policy. So this intersection that we talk about today. So just some ideas, like the summation of sort of different topics that have come up here. Primarily, science is in the service of life. So from our ancient ancestors figuring out when to harvest their crops and survive, science and technology that comes from science has improved our health as a species. Generally speaking, we're moving towards more peace rather than more violence as a species, more prosperity, and a deeper understanding of reality. This is what science is bringing us. And science doesn't happen in the monologue. So, and it doesn't happen yelling, typically. That's the other thing. Science is a process that happens through consensus. How we think about science, how we make decisions about science, that's a little bit different. And the reporting of science and the interpretation of science is challenging because meaning and context are complex, but they're fundamental to actually understanding the science. And so, yes, we might have a few people who disagree with the consensus. That's always the way. But when we overvalue the voices of those few from the many, it sometimes leads us to confusing places. Science policy is not based only on science. And that's really important to remember. And it probably shouldn't be because science has a particular idea in mind. And that's the context in which it is. And behavioral science is a science. This is really important. It's really underutilized in public policy. So when we look at things like, we can look at vaccine mandates, how that is communicated will have a great impact on how people respond to it. This is something I'm a big proponent of. Like the way this talk was put together was utilizing some behavioral psychology to get everybody on board with my opinion from the beginning and not bring up things to trigger everybody from an early point. Because it's real. This was really one of my greatest benefits to the office I worked with, National Science Foundation. My job was to prime the committees, to get a group of people to work together and to understand they come up with biases and opinions that may not be useful or relevant to the information we need from them. So I'll just sort of leave this last slide up there if anybody likes to talk, but these are like some of the ideas. I chose ideas that are not typically super aligned necessarily with the right-wing ideologies, but ones that are sort of more in our consensus and even more left-wing ideologies, just to see how people respond to certain ideas. Pseudoscience ideas or some ideas that are based in science, which some people strongly disagree with, but they're there. We can talk about them if you like, or I can answer any questions or respond to any thoughts you guys have as well.
Great. I think we have a hand up already from Cliff.
Hi. Yeah, sorry I'm hogging the mic here. I wanted to come back to the Trimble effect.
Mm-hmm.
Thought that was interesting. I hadn't heard of it described in that way before. And I feel like as humans, we maybe should be better about this. Like, am I right? Is there a moral obligation to give credit where credit is due to the originators of new ideas and proponents of new truth? And if we agree that that's something we should strive for as humans, how do we know we're doing it any better now than we have in the past? Is there any hope?
Well, there's definitely hope because things are changing. There are a generation of kids growing up with the recognition that it's important to acknowledge people's contributions, no matter who they are or what they've done. It's important because we have a generation who now want to see themselves represented in the stories of science that we tell. And we also have people telling these stories who themselves are ignorant, what's called, have you ever heard of the Fibonacci sequence? Fibonacci is, I actually have it here. Wait, let me see. Where is it? I think it's a few slides down. There it is. Fibonacci. So this is a spiral. It's a spiral you see all through nature that is based on a series of numbers. So it was called Fibonacci. There was never actually a Fibonacci. There was a guy named Pigogno out of Pisa, whose father's name was Bonacci. And Fibonacci means the son of Bonacci. Somebody mistranslated him, and that's who he became. So this became a very famous series in mathematics. He was never the creator of this. He translated the works of an Indian mathematician named Aryabhata. And Aryabhata collected works of existing mathematicians, one the name of Pingala, who actually came up with the series. This was thousands of years ago. Today, if you see a shape like this, people will know the name Fibonacci. They will not know the name Pingala. We can repeat it over and over again, but people are a little bit stuck until they're open to this and until it moves forward. So those of us who know better, do better. And with that attitude going forward, hopefully things change. But it takes an effort. It takes a tremendous effort, and it takes interest as well. So a lot of what I've learned about the actual history of science has not come from any books that I've known, no textbooks or standard things. It's having the resources to look up information. It's thanks to the work of uncredited people who are creating, for example, in Wikipedia, there's one woman who has been creating the Wikipedia pages for women in science because they simply didn't exist on Wikipedia. And slowly, as people with the interest and the passion for this particular area continue to work and be rewarded for their work, then it'll shift us. But we have biases. Your chance of seeing, not yours, I should say a person's, because it's not just you in particular, but my chance of seeing a woman's work as more valuable than a man who's contributed the same amount of work is smaller. The chances of my brain identifying somebody who looks different than me as a potential threat is higher. And this is all the social programming. We did this last week. I did a lecture on essentially the neuroscience of essentially our nervous system, that we have firmware and we have software in our system. And, the firmware is an aspect of our genetic predisposition, the gift of our ancestors. And some of that firmware is, early childhood programming of the culture around us that we have inherited, and we have internalized these values of the culture in which we were raised. And it takes a certain amount of energy and an exceptional interest to shift that. But what's amazing about our neurobiology is that an awareness of our bias starts to short circuit that bias. So just questioning ourselves gets in the way of that amygdaloid response, the visceral response of our systems that make us more open to new pieces of information. So
Well, thank you for teaching me the word amygdaloid. I'd never heard that one before.
Amygdaloid response.
That's a good
Your
one.
amygdala is your animal response. It's like in milliseconds, your amygdaloid response. It's like it's the part of your brain that's like, run, watch out. It's the part of your brain keeping you alive. Whereas your
Yeah.
frontal cortex, which is the evolutionarily more recent part of your brain, that's the one where you get a choice. That one takes about 2 seconds. So that importance of the pause in like Zen and yoga practices is not just about because it's nice to not just because it's nice to stop and share and be still, but part of that is because literally another part of your brain is waking up and taking over, and then you have a choice. Maybe there's some not consensus on that.
I had a question actually, but Matthias brought up something really good. Can you elaborate a little bit on what GMOs are and how it is exactly that they have saved lives? Because that was the text on one of your slides.
Yeah, that's genetically modified organisms. So genetically modified food. So almost everything we eat today has been genetically modified from its original form. Intentionally genetically modified food. Humanity has been doing this for a long time. We can feed more people with less space, which is essentially one of the big ideas behind this. But sort of the conflation of the science and the public health aspect of GMOs has come with how agricultural companies have used the technology of GMOs, and what it's done to the environment. So there's the environmental consequences of how some of these large agricultural companies have utilized GMOs to destroy large pieces of the earth, versus the technology of GMOs in particular, which has been a way to essentially get more yield out of the same crop and to be able to grow food in places that previously we were not able to grow food.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And I will go on to my question now, which is full disclosure, something we discussed when we were talking about you making this presentation. It sounds from everything that you've said tonight that the area with the most potential for growth in American politics and policy might be science communication. Are you aware of any efforts to cultivate science communicators in academia or within the policy community?
I mean, not that I can. There's a lot of organizations where this is a big part. So the AAAS, the one organization that funded my time in DC, they're the publishers of Science magazine, and they have cultivated now a couple of politicians, basically, who were scientists, and organizations like that, and even the National Academy. So there are the people who are in academic science versus the people who are communicating academic science. And those two pathways are not always compatible. The rewards for academic science is very different, and it's a challenge to do both, in that the rewards for either of those things are sometimes not compatible. But what is happening is sometimes in certain institutions, there's becoming a system, sort of like a two-tier system. So rewards for teaching and communication, essentially. But they're few and far between. So what has been a highly competitive working environment has become more so. And in that context, there's just not a lot of space for alternative pathways.
Okay, thank you. I think Cliff has our next question, and then Dawn.
Last one for me, I promise. I mean, unless something really inspires me. I want to come back to the point that you mentioned with humility, near the middle, I believe, or maybe a little towards the beginning, and especially the, for want of a better word, the bravery to say, I don't know. Maybe it's the maturity to say, I don't know. I have a hypothesis I wanted to share with the group, and so here goes. I'll be brief. I think fear is the result of having to say, I don't know, for a lot of people. And I think that desperate and even deadly measures come from people's refusal to face the fear resulting from that big, scary, I don't know. If you agree with me, and if I'm right, I think that means we need to empower people to face that fear and not grasp onto things like horse dewormer and internal bleaching and vaccine refusal. And so then my question to the group becomes, what leverage do we have against that fear of the big I don't know? How do we make people empowered to say that and not try desperate, stupid things?
Yeah, well, you're really hitting in the heart of behavioral sciences, because you're completely right. Like that's the amygdaloid response, the terror. And some people, the amygdaloid response is the visceral response, and then the frontal cortex kicks in, and we're able to sort of say, okay, I know I'm afraid, but like, what's the right thing here? Not everybody has that capacity at this moment, that their frontal cortex reaction is the exact same as their visceral reaction. There's no conflict. And that can be extremely challenging to shift. And this is why it's important when we're talking to people, so arguing with someone who's stuck in that fear response is a waste of your time. And that's really hard, because really you want to set them straight. Like, I get that. You really want to set them straight. But arguing with them when they're in that response is not, it might vent some frustration, but as far as changing their mind, it's more likely to push them in the opposite direction. What the behavioral science of things like cult dynamics. So cult dynamics is really how people can be hijacked because of that fear response into believing things that are illogical and make no sense. And what works better than logic and information is things like listening and compassion. The things that us as being frustrated people are least likely to be able to do is the thing that works the best. The things like, watching my family sort of go down the rabbit hole of QAnon and things like that. They weren't lacking information. If they wanted to know about science, I'm always a great person to give them details on science. They weren't lacking information. There were some fears and ideas being reinforced through that ideology. And that was more comforting than living in a state of chronic anxiety from being in that ideology. And that's a problem. And so like Adam or Rush Holt had mentioned, working in policy or simply working with people, we have to have a bigger idea of what's right and what's the step to take. Because, what's right might be to, bring people into science, but the step to take to get there is not to teach them science. It's to, have compassion and guide them back to who they are and guide them back to a sense of safety that they may not have.
It's very counterintuitive, but I can see how it plays out.
Yeah.
All right. And we've got Dawn up now, and I'd like to put out a last call for any questions. So get your hands up in the chat box, please. Dawn, go ahead.
Hi, I just want to thank you, Tammy, for a great lecture. It was much better than I even expected it would be. I learned a lot. That's admitting something here. And you also, I like controversies, and I work for a pharmaceutical company. I'll say it here. I work for Novartis. I work in the drug safety department, by the way. So I'm not at the forefront of the, our drugs are great and all this. Sometimes we have to kind of, I see how my bosses or whatever have to kind of pull other people in the company back a little bit about maybe, making a little bit too much of noise about how great our drugs are. So what do I need? This is my commercial. It's the same thing. Every drug you take is a risk benefit question. If you have a really serious disease, then you better be willing to put up with some or take the risk of some really serious side effects. If it's not so serious, the cold or whatever, then this drug is not going to get on the market. If it has serious side effects. So that's what people have to know and often forget. That aside, that's just my little commercial here, and it's very similar to what you said about this idea of, is it safe or not? What was you made a very interesting comment about, what to discuss about modern pharmaceuticals and like believing in being healthy or something. I can't remember exactly.
It's something. If you're impressed by the mind's ability to heal yourself, you're going to love modern pharmaceuticals.
Right.
Like essentially the concept of the double-blind studies. Placebo effect is an effect.
Yeah, exactly.
We have a capacity, but medical pharmaceuticals have to do better than that.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
or they're not drugs.
Right.
But the drugs we have that are approved, we have to have double-blind studies because we've realized if the doctor knows what's placebo and what's not, they give cues to the patient, and then they were finding a placebo effect just from one person in that interaction, knowing what was right. So they have to lie to the doctors, lie to the patients, try it and see if it does better than placebo. And if it doesn't do better than that, then it doesn't get approved.
So in other words, you're not completely critical of the pharmaceutical companies. Then you see. Yes, what I'm trying to say is that I have all sorts of people around me who mistrust pharmaceutical companies in the research they do, and I said it's a lot of work that goes into it. This is science, and they have to convince the authorities, and they're not happy. They don't want to register something that might be unsafe or ineffective, and
and it's.
Go ahead.
And because I understand the process. Like if people who understand the process of pharmaceuticals know how much work is required just to get something to the point that it gets approved. And the process doesn't slow down or doesn't speed up for anybody. Even with the coronavirus, the fact that we had a go and then a stop with a couple of the vaccinations, people took that as a bad sign, but that's a good sign. It means that the process is working. Even if there was a rare side effect that nobody had heard of before, the fact that they stopped everything to check that side effect means that the system is actually working. And pharmaceuticals, it's gotten quite conspiratorial with pharmaceutical companies because pharmaceutical companies aren't in charge, and they can be in the pockets of whoever, but there's a process that's far beyond any individual. It's a little bit like voting. All of you guys have been involved with the voting. People who think that it's easy to manipulate a voting system has clearly never actually taken part in the process of voting. Because how many checks there are, how difficult it is just to, falsify or do anything like that. It's a little similar to that. Understanding the process, it can like the point that Cliff brought up, understanding the process can reduce the fear response. Even though Trump as president made me quite nervous, also understanding how little power the president had in a lot of areas of the government actually made me feel a little better, because although he created a lot of mess in those 4 years, a lot of that mess is able to be undone because he didn't understand how to make a mess at a large level. And so although he did some things, a lot of it was undoable essentially.
Great. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, looks like the queue has emptied out, so I'm going to go ahead and stop recording here.